Excuse me, ma'am, but you can't be here. The officer's voice sliced through the low hum of conversation like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Heads began to turn as his boots thudded against the polished floor, each step echoing the authority he carried so comfortably. His uniform, pristine and pressed, seemed to grow tighter around his chest as he puffed it out, squaring his shoulders. He loomed closer, towering over the woman near the podium. His gaze was sharp, dissecting, like she was something out of place, something that didn't belong. "You heard me," he said, voice low but laced with venom. "This area is restricted. I need you to step back before I have you removed." The woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her posture steady and composed, though the room seemed to vibrate with tension around her. People were staring now. Some whispered to one another. Others avoided eye contact altogether, pretending not to notice the growing confrontation. But no one stepped in. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said finally, her voice measured but firm, the kind of tone that could steady a storm, if the storm was willing to listen. The officer smirked, a slow, condescending curl of his lips. "I don't think so," he snapped, stepping even closer until the space between them vanished. "And I don't like attitude, especially from someone like you." Her eyes flickered for just a moment, a slight shift that most people wouldn't notice. But he did. He latched onto it, fed off it. "Someone like me?" she asked, the words deliberate. "You know what I mean." His smirk grew wider, hungrier. "I see this all the time. People who think they can just walk in and pretend they belong. But not today." His voice carried farther now, loud enough for everyone to hear. The whispers in the room turned into murmurs, rippling outward like waves. "Let go of my arm," she said suddenly, her tone snapping like a whip. But he didn't let go. Instead, his grip tightened. "You don't tell me what to do," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "I give the orders here. Not you." There was a beat of silence, heavy and suffocating. And then, as if the moment wasn't tense enough, he did something that left the room paralyzed. He spit. It happened so fast that for a moment, it didn't feel real. The wetness hit her cheek, slid down her skin, and pooled near the corner of her mouth. The gasp came first, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd. Then a chair scraped against the floor. Glass shattered. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." But the officer didn't move. He stood there, chest heaving, eyes locked on hers, waiting for her to crumble. Waiting for her to shrink back, to wipe her face, to look away in shame. But she didn't. Instead, she stood perfectly still, the spit glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The officer leaned back slightly, clearly expecting more of a reaction. "What? Got nothing to say now?" "That's what I thought," he sneered. "People like you always think you're better than you are. But not here. Not in my building. His building." That's what he thought. Her fists clenched at her sides, but she didn't lift them. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Not yet. A man in a suit appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face pale and uneasy. "Officer," he said, his voice tight. "You might want to stop." The officer barely turned his head. "I've got this handled." "No," the man said, stepping closer. His voice wavered slightly, but it was louder now. "You don't." The officer's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man swallowed hard, his gaze flicking toward the woman, the one who still hadn't moved, still hadn't wiped the spit from her face. And then the woman spoke again. "You'll regret this." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The words carried through the room like thunder before a storm, and for the first time, the officer hesitated. Just a flicker of doubt. But it was too late. She reached into her bag and pulled out something small, something metallic. A badge. And she didn't just hold it up, she shoved it toward him, her eyes locking onto his with a fire that burned brighter than the humiliation he tried to inflict. The crowd's whispers erupted into shouts. Phones flashed as people scrambled to record. The officer stepped back, stumbling slightly as his face drained of color. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No way." But there it was, in her hand, plain as day. She was his new boss. The weight of the realization hit him like a punch, but the look in her eyes said it wasn't over, not even close. Because what he'd done couldn't be undone. Not in front of this many witnesses. Not with cameras recording every second. And whatever came next, whatever she had planned, was going to make him wish he had walked away when he had the chance. But what would she do? How far would she go to make him pay? And could he handle the consequences when the truth finally came out? Stay with us, because the fallout from this moment will leave you speechless. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination of any kind. This channel is a safe space where we celebrate diversity, equality, and justice. Our stories reflect the struggles and triumphs of real people, and we believe in using our platform to inspire change and highlight important issues. To all our Black viewers, your voices matter, your stories matter, and you are seen, valued, and respected here. Now, sit back and get ready for an intense and emotional story that will leave you speechless. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new twist. Enjoy the story. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the conference hall, spilling onto the polished floors and bouncing off the glass podium at the front of the room. The hum of voices filled the space, low murmurs of anticipation mixed with the occasional clinking of glasses and hurried footsteps. It was the kind of crowd that radiated confidence and authority, polished shoes, pressed suits, and sharp eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. But none of them noticed her. Not yet. Imani Williams adjusted the cuff of her navy blue blazer and smoothed down the front of her blouse. Her reflection in the mirror earlier that morning had shown a woman prepared, composed, and unshakable, but now, standing here, surrounded by strangers who didn't know who she was, or what she represented, she felt the weight of every expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't nervous, not exactly. Nervousness was something she'd learned to bury a long time ago. What she felt now was closer to readiness, sharp, deliberate, like the edge of a blade waiting to cut through whatever stood in its way. Imani wasn't supposed to be here. At least, that's what people like Officer Daniel Carter believed. She'd seen men like him her entire career, men who carried their authority like a weapon and their biases like armor. Men who smiled at cameras and scowled at protests. Men who followed the rules until the rules inconvenienced them. And Daniel? He wasn't just another officer. He was the kind of man who believed his badge was his identity and that people like her, Black, ambitious, and unapologetic, needed to stay in their place. It wasn't surprising, then, that their paths had crossed this way. Imani had spent years navigating spaces that weren't built for her, from police academies to precinct offices, climbing higher with every setback, every whispered insult, every closed door. And now, after all the tests, the late nights, and the fights to be heard, she was standing at the edge of something bigger than herself. But Daniel didn't see any of that. He didn't see her as someone who had earned this moment. He saw her as someone who didn't belong. She had arrived early, wanting to get a feel for the room before the conference started. The event was meant to celebrate advancements in community policing, a topic Imani had spent most of her career fighting to improve. But as she scanned the crowd, she noticed the tension bubbling just beneath the surface. The officers who smiled too wide. The ones who wouldn't make eye contact. And then there was Daniel. He was standing by the entrance when he saw her, his posture stiffening as if her presence alone was a threat. Daniel Carter was everything Imani had come to expect from men like him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and cold eyes that seemed to dare anyone to question his authority. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the lights, but there was something else about him, something heavier. He carried himself like a man who believed he'd earned his place at the top of the food chain and didn't take kindly to anyone challenging that position. And Imani? She was a challenge he couldn't ignore. She didn't notice him approach at first. She was too focused on the notes she'd prepared, going over every word in her head to make sure it landed exactly as she intended. But then his voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and dismissive. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this area is restricted." Imani looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for the briefest moment, there was silence. She could see it in his expression, the flicker of disdain, the certainty that she wasn't supposed to be here. "I'm not lost," she said, her voice even. His smirk was slight, but it was there. "I'm sure you're not," he said. "But I'll need to see some identification before you go any further." She reached for her bag, already feeling the heat rising in her chest, but before she could even pull it out, he stepped closer. "Actually," he said, "why don't we make this simple? You can wait outside until someone comes to handle this properly." "Handle this properly." Imani felt the words like a slap, but she didn't move. "I don't need to wait outside," she said. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The murmurs around them grew louder. Imani could feel the weight of the stairs pressing in on her, but Daniel didn't back down. Instead, he squared his shoulders and leaned in. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice dropping. "This isn't a debate. You can either leave quietly, or I'll make sure you leave." Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag, but before she could say anything, he stepped even closer. "People like you always think you can just walk in and act like you own the place," he said, his voice cutting through her like ice. The words hit harder than she expected, but she didn't let it show. She refused to let him see her falter. And then it happened. It was so fast, so shocking, that for a moment, it didn't feel real. Daniel spat at her. The room fell silent. The crowd froze. Imani felt the wetness slide down her cheek, but she didn't move. She didn't wipe it away. She didn't flinch. She stood there, fists clenched, letting the moment burn into her memory. She wouldn't forget this. Not ever. Daniel stepped back, smirking, as if he'd already won. "Clean yourself up," he said. "You're embarrassing yourself." But Imani didn't move. She didn't look away. And as the silence stretched, she saw something flicker in his eyes, doubt. And then she spoke. "You'll regret this." The words were soft but sharp enough to cut through the air like glass. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, someone else spoke. "Officer Carter," a man's voice interrupted, trembling slightly. "You might want to stop." Daniel hesitated, but it was too late. Imani was already reaching into her bag. The weight of what was about to happen hung in the air, and as she pulled out the badge, Daniel's face paled. But this wasn't the end. For Imani, it was just the beginning. Imani stood in front of the mirror in the small restroom adjacent to the conference hall, her hands gripping the edges of the sink so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The cold water she had splashed on her face moments ago was already drying, leaving behind only the faintest trace of moisture on her skin, but it did nothing to cool the heat burning in her chest. She stared at her reflection, at the calm, composed face staring back at her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt it crack. She had faced a lifetime of obstacles, side eyes in meetings, whispers behind her back, colleagues who smiled to her face and mocked her the moment she walked away. She'd built walls, armored herself with professionalism and grit, refusing to let anyone see how much it cost her. But this, what happened out there in front of all those people, this was something else entirely. Her phone buzzed against the marble counter, breaking the stillness. She reached for it, seeing a text from Detective Aaron Blake. He was the only one she trusted completely in the department, the one who had backed her from the very beginning. "You okay? I saw what happened. You want me to handle it?" Imani let out a slow breath, her fingers hovering over the screen before she typed her response. Not yet. Stay close. She set the phone down and leaned back against the wall, closing her eyes for just a moment. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when everything she'd worked for was hanging by a thread. But the image of Daniel's face, the smirk he wore as he stepped away from her, was burned into her mind. The smugness. The certainty that he'd get away with it. The door creaked open, and Imani snapped her eyes open as Aaron stepped inside. Are you sure you don't want me to pull him off duty? His voice was low but firm, his eyes scanning her face like he was searching for cracks. I can have it done in 5 minutes. She shook her head. Not yet. Aaron took a step closer, lowering his voice even more. Imani, that man just humiliated you in front of half the department. You can't just let this go. Her eyes flashed. You think I'm letting this go? His expression softened, but he didn't back down. No. I think you're planning something. And I want to make sure you don't cross a line you can't come back from. Imani stepped away from the sink, straightening her shoulders. I've spent my entire career following the rules. Playing it safe. And where has it gotten me? Spit in my face by a man who thinks he's untouchable. Well, he's about to find out just how wrong he is. Aaron's gaze didn't waver. What are you going to do? Imani didn't answer. Instead, she brushed past him, her heels clicking against the tile as she walked out the door and back into the chaos of the conference hall. The room had settled somewhat, but she could feel the eyes following her as she moved through the crowd. Whispers buzzed around her like flies, and she could almost feel the weight of their judgment pressing against her skin. But she kept her head high, her expression calm and unreadable as she made her way toward the stage. Daniel was still there, leaning casually against one of the pillars near the podium, talking to another officer as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just degraded her in front of everyone. He caught her eye as she approached, and for a split second, something flickered in his gaze, uncertainty, maybe, or the first hint of fear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Changed your mind? He said, smirking as she stopped in front of him. Ready to leave quietly? Imani's voice was like steel. You and I need to talk. His smirk didn't falter. About what? Now. He hesitated, but then shrugged, pushing himself off the pillar and motioning for her to lead the way. She turned and headed toward one of the empty conference rooms off to the side, not bothering to look back to see if he was following. She knew he would. The room was small and dimly lit, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound as the door clicked shut behind them. Imani turned to face him, her arms crossed over her chest. What the hell was that out there? Daniel leaned back against the door, his arms folding as he tilted his head. You're going to have to be more specific. Don't play dumb, she snapped. You know exactly what I'm talking about. His smile faded, replaced by something harder, meaner. You're in over your head, Williams. You think flashing that badge means something? You think it makes you untouchable? Let me tell you something, you don't belong here. And no badge is going to change that. Imani stepped closer, her voice low and steady. You're right about one thing. That badge doesn't make me untouchable. But it does give me the authority to decide what happens to you. And after what you pulled today, you'd better hope I'm feeling generous. For the first time, Daniel's mask slipped. Just for a second. But Imani saw it, the flicker of doubt, the crack in his confidence. You can't do anything to me, he said, but the words didn't carry the same weight. Imani leaned in. Watch me. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, until Daniel finally pushed himself off the door and stormed out, slamming it behind him. Imani stood there for a long moment, her breath coming fast, her hands trembling despite the steel in her spine. She knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Because Daniel wasn't just going to back down. Men like him never did. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly see coming, was how far she was willing to go to make sure he paid for what he did. And when it happened, when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just ruin his career. It would destroy everything he thought he knew about himself. Imani wasn't just here to make a point. She was here to make sure no one ever doubted her again. But first, she had to set the trap. Daniel sat in the dimly lit office, his shoulders tense and squared as if the weight of the room itself was pressing down on him. The air was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were leaning in, ready to collapse. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk, a nervous habit he couldn't seem to stop, even as he told himself to stay calm. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, but it did nothing to cool the heat rising in his chest. His mind raced, replaying the events of the morning in fragmented flashes, the crowd, the murmurs, the looks of shock, and most of all, the way she'd held up that badge. That damn badge. His reflection in the dark computer screen stared back at him, hollow-eyed and tight-lipped. He hated the way he looked right now, cornered, defensive, and unsure. It wasn't a look he was used to. He'd spent years building a reputation as the guy who didn't back down, the guy who always had control. But now he felt exposed. Vulnerable. And he hated it. The sound of the door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. His head jerked up, and there she was. Imani. She didn't knock. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her with a deliberate slowness that sent his pulse spiking. Her face was unreadable, calm, but not soft. Cold, but not emotionless. It was the kind of look that made his stomach twist because he knew it meant trouble. She didn't speak right away, and that silence felt louder than anything she could have said. Daniel straightened in his chair, trying to look composed, but his hands betrayed him. They twitched slightly before he clasped them together on the desk, forcing himself to stay still. Is this how you handle things now? Imani's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Hiding in an office while the fallout keeps spreading? Her words hit him harder than he expected, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, forcing a smirk he didn't feel. I'm not hiding, he shot back, his voice steady despite the fire simmering beneath the surface. I'm working. Working, she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. Is that what you call it? Ignoring what happened out there and pretending it'll just disappear? Daniel's eyes hardened. I didn't do anything wrong. Imani stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor in sharp, deliberate movements. You didn't do anything wrong. Her voice dropped, but it didn't lose its edge. You assaulted your superior officer in front of half the department. You humiliated me in front of an entire room of people, and you want to sit here and act like you're the victim? His jaw clenched so tight it ached. I didn't know who you were. And that's supposed to make it better. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking. That's your excuse. You didn't know who I was, so it's fine. That's supposed to justify what you did. Daniel looked away, but she stepped closer, refusing to let him escape the moment. You thought I was nobody, she continued, her voice steady and sharp. You thought I didn't matter, and you could do whatever you wanted. Intimidate me. Belittle me. Spit on me. And no one would care because that's how it's always worked for you, hasn't it? That's what you've been able to get away with before. But not this time. His eyes snapped back to hers, and for the first time, there was something in his gaze that looked like fear. It was buried deep, but it was there. You don't know anything about me, he said, but the words lacked the strength he wanted them to have. Imani leaned in closer, lowering her voice just enough to make him lean in too, as if her words carried weight he couldn't ignore. I know exactly who you are. You're the guy who thinks a badge is a weapon. The guy who thinks authority is something you use to keep people down instead of lifting them up. The guy who doesn't just bend the rules, he breaks them whenever it suits him. Daniel's fists clenched, his knuckles going white. You think you're better than me? No, she said, and her voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. I think I worked harder than you. I think I fought for every inch while you coasted on privilege and connections. And I think that scares you more than anything else. Daniel shoved himself out of his chair so suddenly that it scraped against the floor, the noise sharp and jarring. You don't know what it's like. His voice cracked, and for the first time, there was no mask. Just raw frustration. You don't know what it's like to carry this badge and feel like everyone is waiting for you to screw up. To feel like one wrong move and it's all over. Imani didn't back away. She didn't even blink. You think I don't know what that's like? I've lived it every single day since I stepped into this uniform. The only difference between us is that I don't use it as an excuse to tear other people down. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Daniel's breathing was ragged now, his shoulders rising and falling as if he'd just run a marathon. But there was something else in his eyes, something fragile and unsure. You're done, Daniel, Imani said, her voice quieter but no less firm. You're suspended, effective immediately. His face paled, but he didn't move. You can't, I can, she interrupted, her voice like steel. And I did. The silence stretched out, suffocating. And then, finally, Daniel sank back into his chair like the fight had drained out of him. This isn't over, he muttered, but there was no conviction behind the words. Imani didn't flinch. No, it's not. She turned and walked out, leaving him sitting there in the silence. But as she closed the door behind her, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her shoulders. She had won this round, but she knew Daniel wasn't the type of man to give up easily. Men like him never were. And deep down, she knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had ever underestimated her, dismissed her, or tried to keep her in her place. Daniel might have been the first to fall, but he wouldn't be the last. She was going to make sure of it. But first, she had to be ready for whatever came next. Imani's footsteps echoed down the narrow hallway, her heels striking the tile floor with sharp, deliberate clicks that seemed to reverberate off the walls. Her hands were balled into tight fists at her sides, and her chest burned with the kind of rage that didn't fade easily. She had replayed the confrontation in her mind a dozen times already, each replay fueling the fire inside her. The tension in her shoulders refused to ease, and no matter how many deep breaths she took, the knot in her stomach remained. She paused at the end of the hall, just outside her office door, pressing her palms flat against the wood as if grounding herself. The weight of the last few hours pressed against her ribs, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel it. The humiliation. The anger. The fear that she didn't dare let show. It all lingered just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over if she gave it the chance. But she couldn't afford to let it out. Not now. Not yet. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Another text. The words made her stomach tighten even more. You think this is over? Her thumb hovered over the screen, but she didn't respond. She locked the phone and shoved it back into her pocket, forcing herself to breathe. She wouldn't let fear get the better of her. Not now. Not after everything. The door to her office swung open before she could reach for the handle, and Aaron stepped out, his expression dark and unreadable. He looked her over, his eyes scanning her face like he was searching for cracks, for any sign that she was starting to break. But she wasn't. Not yet. You okay? His voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it, an undercurrent of concern that she didn't have time to deal with. Do I look okay? She shot back, brushing past him and into the office. Aaron followed, shutting the door behind him as she paced to the desk and dropped into the chair. He didn't speak right away, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting for her to let something slip. You pulled him off duty, Aaron finally said, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. It wasn't a question. Imani nodded, her fingers tapping against the edge of the desk. I didn't have a choice. Aaron's brow furrowed. You think that's going to be enough? She looked up at him, her eyes sharp. It's a start. A start. Aaron pushed off the wall, stepping closer. Imani, that man has connections. You know he's not going to let this go quietly. Her voice hardened. I don't expect him to. Aaron ran a hand through his hair, letting out a sharp breath. You're playing with fire. Then let it burn, she snapped, standing so quickly that the chair scraped against the floor. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, before Aaron spoke again, softer this time. What's the plan? Imani's jaw tightened. First, we make sure the suspension sticks. Then we dig deeper. There's more to this, Aaron. I can feel it. He's hiding something. Aaron hesitated, but then he nodded. I'll start making calls. Before he could leave, the office door swung open, and there he was. Daniel. He stepped inside without knocking, his posture rigid and his eyes burning with something darker than anger. He didn't look like the man who'd been humiliated hours earlier. He looked like a man who'd just made a decision, a dangerous one. Aaron moved closer, but Imani raised a hand to stop him. She wouldn't let Daniel see that she needed backup. Not now. You're out of line, she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Daniel's lip curled. No. You're out of line. Imani stepped closer, closing the distance between them. You're suspended. You shouldn't even be in this building right now. Daniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you're untouchable, don't you? You think that badge is going to protect you? She didn't flinch. I don't need protection from you. He scoffed, shaking his head. You're in way over your head, Williams. You have no idea what you're up against. Then why don't you enlighten me, she shot back, folding her arms across her chest. For the first time, Daniel hesitated. It was brief, barely more than a flicker, but it was there. And Imani saw it. There are people in this department who won't let you win, he said finally, his voice low and steady. People who've been here longer than you. People who don't want you here. Then they can come to me themselves, she said. Because I'm not going anywhere. Daniel's eyes darkened. You don't get it, do you? You think this is about me? It's bigger than that. It's bigger than you. Imani took a step closer, her voice dropping. I don't care how big it is. I'm not backing down. Daniel leaned in even closer, his breath hot against her face. You should. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, before Daniel finally stepped back. This isn't over, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. No, Imani said. It's not. Daniel turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Aaron stepped closer, his expression tight. You okay? Imani didn't answer. She couldn't. Her heart was pounding too hard, and her hands were shaking too much. But she forced herself to take a breath, to steady herself. I'm fine, she said finally, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. Aaron studied her for a moment before nodding. I'll be in touch. When the door closed behind him, Imani sank into her chair, her pulse still racing. She knew Daniel wasn't done. Not even close. And as much as she hated to admit it, part of her was scared. But fear wasn't going to stop her. Not now. Not after everything she'd fought for. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she wasn't going to lose. She couldn't. Imani sat in her office, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls. Her hands rested on the edge of the desk, but her fingers tapped nervously against the wood, a rhythm she couldn't seem to control. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Daniel was still coursing through her veins, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down hard. She could still hear his words, could still feel the heat of his anger lingering in the room even after he'd stormed out. He wasn't backing down, and neither was she, but the question that gnawed at her now was how far this was going to go, and how much it was going to cost her. Her phone buzzed, and for a moment, she hesitated before reaching for it. Another anonymous message appeared on the screen, and her stomach twisted. "You should have walked away. Now it's too late." Her breath caught, and her fingers tightened around the phone. She knew this wasn't just about Daniel anymore. Someone else was pulling strings behind the scenes, someone who had more power and more reach than he did. The implications sent a chill through her, but she shoved the fear aside and stood up, pacing the room as her mind raced. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts, and when she opened it, Aaron stood there, his face tight and serious. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door firmly behind him. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low but urgent. Imani folded her arms, bracing herself. "What now?" Aaron hesitated for just a second, but the look in his eyes told her whatever it wasn't good. "Internal Affairs is opening an investigation." Her heart skipped a beat. "On what grounds?" "They're claiming misconduct," Aaron said, and his voice softened. "Against you." The words hit like a punch, knocking the air out of her lungs. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," Aaron said, shaking his head. "But it's already in motion. Someone's pushing this hard, and I don't think it's just Daniel." Imani's mind spun, piecing it together. She'd known this wouldn't be easy. She'd known pushing back would make enemies, but she hadn't expected them to move this fast. The timing was too perfect, too coordinated. This wasn't just retaliation, it was an attempt to take her down before she could go any further. "They're scared," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "They wouldn't be coming at me like this if they weren't scared." Aaron nodded. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean they won't succeed." Imani clenched her jaw, her pulse quickening. "Not if we don't let them." Aaron stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything they can use against you? Anything that might stick?" Imani met his eyes without flinching. "No. I've done everything by the book." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Okay. Then we fight this." Imani exhaled slowly, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. She knew this wasn't just about the investigation. It was about sending a message, not just to her, but to everyone watching. They wanted to remind her who was really in control. The thought made her blood boil, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to lose her focus now. Another knock at the door interrupted them, and this time, it was one of the administrative assistants from the front office. She looked nervous, shifting on her feet as she handed Imani a folder. "This just came in," she said quietly before hurrying out. Imani opened the folder, her eyes scanning the contents. It was a formal notice of investigation from Internal Affairs, but what caught her attention was the list of accusations attached. They weren't just targeting her handling of the situation with Daniel, they were digging into her entire career. Every decision she'd made, every case she'd worked, every complaint, no matter how minor, was suddenly under scrutiny. "They're going to bury me," she said, more to herself than to Aaron. "No," Aaron said firmly. "They're going to try. But they're not going to succeed." Imani looked up at him, and for the first time since this started, she let a flicker of doubt show. "What if they do?" Aaron stepped closer, his voice softer now but no less intense. "Then we fight harder. Imani, you didn't come this far to let them take this away from you. And you're not alone in this. I've got your back. Always." The word settled something in her chest, but the fear lingered. She nodded, swallowing hard before setting the folder down and straightening her shoulders. Then let's make sure they regret coming after me. Aaron's phone buzzed, and he stepped away to answer it, leaving Imani alone with her thoughts. She paced the room again, her mind racing as she tried to anticipate their next move. She knew she couldn't afford any missteps now. Every decision mattered. Every word. The door creaked open, and this time, it wasn't Aaron. It was Daniel. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "You really think you're going to win this?" he said finally, his voice low and almost mocking. Imani didn't flinch. "I don't think it. I know it." Daniel's lips curled into a smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're making a mistake." "No," she said, stepping closer. "I made a choice. And so did you. Now you get to live with the consequences." For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, but then he closed it again and turned to leave. Imani watched him go, her heart pounding, but she refused to let herself feel relief. Not yet. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And she wasn't going to stop until every last piece of this was exposed. Imani stood in the dimly lit room, her hands gripping the edges of the desk as if letting go would send her spiraling. Her pulse was still racing, her mind spinning with every word Daniel had thrown at her before he walked out. She wanted to believe that his confidence had cracked, that the fear she saw in his eyes was real, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The way he looked at her, the way his voice lingered on that last warning, it wasn't just anger. It was something darker. Something calculated. And it left a pit in her stomach that refused to go away. Aaron was pacing the room now, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but sharp as he barked orders into the receiver. Imani barely heard him. Her focus was locked on the folder still sitting open on her desk, the accusations, the threats, the weight of it all pressing down harder with every passing second. She'd fought too hard to get here, sacrificed too much, and now it felt like it was all hanging by a thread. Aaron ended the call and turned to face her, his expression tight. "Internal affairs is moving fast," he said, his voice clipped. "They've already pulled records on your last 3 cases. They're looking for anything they can use to make this stick." Imani's jaw tightened. "Let them look. They won't find anything." Aaron stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't know that. These people don't play fair, Imani. If they can't find something, they'll create it." She met his eyes, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "Then we'll be ready for it." Aaron ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping even lower. "Look, I know you're trying to stay strong, but you don't have to do this alone. You have people who believe in you, people who will fight for you. But you have to let us in." Imani exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "I know," she said quietly. "But this isn't just about me anymore. If they take me down, what kind of message does that send? That people like me can't lead? That we don't belong here? I can't let that happen." Aaron nodded, his expression softening. "We won't let that happen." The words hung in the air, heavy with determination, but before either of them could say anything else, there was another knock at the door. Imani straightened, bracing herself, but when the door opened, it wasn't who she expected. Chief Reynolds stepped inside, his face unreadable, his hands tucked into the pockets of his suit. He closed the door behind him and looked at Imani, then at Aaron, before finally speaking. "We need to talk." Aaron glanced at Imani, but she nodded, and he stepped aside, letting the chief move closer. "I just got off the phone with Internal Affairs," Reynolds said, his voice calm but firm. "They're recommending an immediate administrative leave while the investigation plays out." Imani's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. "That's not necessary," she said, keeping her voice even. Reynolds' eyes narrowed. You don't get to decide that. Imani took a step forward, refusing to back down. No, but you do. And if you let them do this, if you let them sideline me, you're giving them exactly what they want. Reynolds hesitated, but then he shook his head. This isn't about what they want. It's about protecting this department. Protecting it from what? Imani shot back. From accountability? From someone finally standing up and saying enough? Reynolds' expression hardened. From chaos. And whether you like it or not, that's what this is turning into. Imani's voice dropped, her words sharp. Chaos is what happens when you let men like Daniel think they're untouchable. Chaos is what happens when you let fear dictate your decisions. You put me in this position because you trusted me to lead. So let me lead. Reynolds stared at her, and for a moment, she thought he might actually listen. But then he shook his head again, and her heart sank. I can't, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Imani's stomach turned, but before she could say anything, Aaron stepped in. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice tight. Pulling her now doesn't solve anything. It only makes it worse. Reynolds looked at Aaron, then back at Imani, and for the first time, there was something almost like regret in his eyes. But it didn't matter. The decision was already made. I need your badge, he said, and the words hit like a hammer. Imani froze, her fingers instinctively reaching for the badge clipped to her belt. She felt the weight of it, the weight of everything it represented, but her hand wouldn't move. Reynolds stepped closer, his voice softer now. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Imani's breath shook as she unhooked the badge and placed it in his outstretched hand. The metal felt cold against her skin, and the sound it made as it hit his palm echoed louder than it should have. Reynolds gave her a nod, then turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Imani stood there, her hands trembling, her chest tight. Aaron reached out, but she stepped away, shaking her head. I'm fine, she said, even though the words felt hollow. Aaron didn't believe her, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood there, silent, as she sank back into the chair and buried her face in her hands. The weight of everything came crashing down all at once, the humiliation, the anger, the fear, and for the first time since this started, she let herself feel it. But even as the tears threatened to fall, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. Imani sat in her dimly lit apartment, the silence stretching around her like an unwelcome visitor. The badge was gone, taken from her hands like it was nothing more than a piece of metal, but the weight of its absence pressed against her chest, heavier than she expected. Her fingers hovered over her phone, scrolling through missed calls and unread messages. Aaron had tried to reach her 3 times already, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Not yet. Not until she could figure out what came next. The knock at the door startled her, sharp and deliberate. She froze for a moment before standing and crossing the room, her heart thudding against her ribs as she peeked through the peephole. Aaron. She hesitated, then unlocked the door and stepped back as he let himself in. He didn't waste time. You need to get ahead of this, he said, his voice urgent but not unkind. The longer you stay quiet, the worse it's going to get. Imani turned away, walking back toward the couch and sinking into it. What am I supposed to say? That I let them take everything I worked for without a fight? That they're right to question me? Aaron closed the door and stepped closer, his voice softer now. No one thinks they're right. They're trying to bury you because you made them uncomfortable. Because you didn't play by their rules. Imani laughed bitterly, shaking her head. And what good did it do me? Look where I am, Aaron. Suspended, stripped of my badge, and one step away from losing everything. Aaron crossed the room and sat down across from her, leaning forward. You haven't lost yet. But you will if you give up now. She met his eyes, and for the first time since this started, she let him see the exhaustion in hers. I'm tired, Aaron. Tired of fighting battles no one else has to fight. Tired of proving myself over and over again just to have it all ripped away. Aaron leaned closer. I know you're tired. But this isn't just about you anymore. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for everyone who's watching this unfold, everyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. If you let them take this from you, you're letting them win. Imani's jaw tightened, and she looked away, but Aaron wasn't done. You think this is about your badge? It's not. It's about what that badge represents. And whether you like it or not, people are looking at you to see what happens next. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. And what if I can't fix this? Aaron's voice was steady. Then you go down swinging. The words hit her harder than she expected, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed again. She reached for it and froze when she saw the name on the screen. Chief Reynolds. Aaron saw it too. Answer it, he said, but Imani hesitated. Finally, she hit the button and held the phone to her ear. This is Imani. Reynolds' voice came through, low and heavy. We need to meet. Imani's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. About what? Just meet me, he said. Tonight. 7 o'clock. The station. The line went dead before she could respond, and Aaron was already on his feet. What was that about? I don't know, she said, standing slowly. But I'm going to find out. Aaron grabbed his jacket. I'm coming with you. The station felt different at night, quieter, darker, but no less suffocating. Imani walked through the halls with Aaron close behind her, her heart pounding as they approached Reynolds' office. He was waiting inside, his expression unreadable as he motioned for them to sit. Close the door, he said, and Aaron did as he was told before taking a seat next to Imani. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. Imani's stomach twisted, but she nodded. This investigation. It's bigger than you think, Reynolds said. And it's not just about what happened with Daniel. There are people in this department who have been looking for a reason to take you down since the day you walked in. Aaron stiffened beside her. Who? Reynolds shook his head. It doesn't matter who. What matters is that they're organized, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want. Imani's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. And what do they want? To send a message, Reynolds said. That no one challenges them and gets away with it. Imani leaned forward. Then why are you telling me this? You already took my badge. Reynolds' eyes softened. Because I didn't have a choice. And because I don't think you deserve what's happening to you. But I can't protect you if you're not willing to protect yourself. Imani's voice hardened. So what do you want me to do? Reynolds hesitated, but then he slid a folder across the desk. Fight back. Imani opened the folder and froze. Inside were documents, emails, complaints, and evidence connecting Daniel to others in the department. Evidence of cover-ups, falsified reports, and abuses of power. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Where did you get this? Reynolds looked her in the eye. Let's just say not everyone in this department wants to see you fail. Aaron leaned closer, his eyes scanning the papers. This is enough to bury him. And not just him, Reynolds said. But it's risky. If this gets out, it's going to tear this department apart. Imani closed the folder, her mind spinning. She'd wanted to take Daniel down, but this? This was bigger than him. Bigger than anything she'd expected. Reynolds' voice was quiet but firm. You have a choice to make. You can walk away, let this investigation run its course, and hope for the best. Or you can use this and make sure the right people pay for what they've done. Imani's hands trembled as she gripped the folder. She could feel Aaron watching her, waiting for her to decide. And she knew, In that moment, there was no turning back. Imani sat in the interrogation room, her fingers drumming lightly against the table as she waited. The folder Reynolds had given her lay open in front of her, its contents spread out in sharp, damning lines of text and images. She'd spent hours going through it, memorizing every detail, every thread of corruption that tied Daniel and his network of officers together. It was bigger than she'd thought, far bigger, and it was clear now that Daniel hadn't just been acting out of arrogance or entitlement. He'd been protecting something. Or someone. And now, it was about to come crashing down. The door creaked open, and Daniel walked in, escorted by two officers who looked far more uncomfortable than he did. He was in plain clothes now, his badge already surrendered, his gun stripped from his holster, but there was still that defiance in his eyes, that unwillingness to accept that he'd lost. He sat across from her, leaning back in his chair with the same smirk he'd worn the first time they met. Imani didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply slid the folder across the table and watched as Daniel's eyes dropped to the papers inside. His smirk faltered. "You really think this changes anything?" His voice was quieter now, but it still carried that edge of desperation. Imani leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through his bravado. "It already has. You're done, Daniel. And you're not taking anyone down with you this time." He swallowed hard, flipping through the documents as his confidence unraveled. "You don't know what you're doing. If you go public with this, you'll tear the department apart." Imani didn't look away. "Good. Maybe it's time it was torn apart. Maybe it's time people see the truth about what's been happening behind closed doors." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder and pushed it back toward her. "You think you're a hero? You think anyone's going to thank you for this? You're going to be the one they blame when everything falls apart." Imani smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Maybe. But I'd rather be blamed for doing the right thing than spend another day pretending none of this is happening." Daniel's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, he looked small, defeated. He tried to speak again, but the words never came. Instead, he sat back, his jaw tight, as if the reality of his downfall was finally sinking in. The door opened again, and Aaron stepped inside with Reynolds close behind him. Aaron's expression was unreadable, but Reynolds looked like he hadn't slept in days. He glanced at the folder, then at Daniel, and nodded toward the officers standing by the door. "Take him," Reynolds said, his voice low but firm. Daniel didn't resist. He stood slowly, casting one last look at Imani before the officers led him out. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes. No arrogance. Only resignation. When the door closed, Reynolds turned to Imani. "You know this isn't over, right? The fallout from this, it's going to get ugly." Imani stood, gathering the documents and sliding them back into the folder. "Let it. The truth's already out there now. They can't stop it." Aaron stepped closer, his voice softer. "And what about you? Are you ready for what comes next?" Imani met his gaze, and for the first time in days, she felt the weight in her chest start to lift. "I've been ready." It wasn't easy. The investigation stretched for weeks, exposing layer after layer of corruption. Officers were suspended. Some resigned before the charges hit. Others weren't as lucky. Daniel's case became the centerpiece, his actions a symbol of everything wrong with the system. But Imani didn't back down. She testified, she stood in front of cameras, and she faced every question and every accusation with the same steady resolve. And when it was over, when the dust settled and the headlines faded, she walked back into the department, not as a victim, but as a leader. Her badge was returned, but it no longer felt like something she had to prove she'd earned. She knew now that it wasn't the badge that gave her power. It was the woman who wore it. Aaron stayed by her side through it all, and Reynolds, despite his doubts, became one of her strongest allies. He admitted he'd been wrong, and while it didn't erase the past, it was enough to help them move forward. As for Daniel, his trial ended with a guilty verdict. The image of him being led out of the courtroom in cuffs made headlines, but for Imani, it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. He'd built his career on fear and intimidation, but in the end, he couldn't escape the truth. Imani stood outside the courthouse the day the verdict was read, watching as reporters swarmed to get a statement. She didn't stop to answer questions. She just walked past them, her head high, her shoulders back. Because this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Stories like Imani's remind us how important it is to stand up against injustice, even when the odds feel impossible. It's easy to look the other way, to avoid confrontation, but change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people like Imani refuse to back down, when they choose courage over fear and justice over comfort. So ask yourself, how far would you go to stand up for what's right? Would you risk your career? Your reputation? Your safety? Or would you let fear win? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let us know how this story made you feel. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent? We'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that will leave you questioning, reflecting, and inspired. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next twist.